Here in Singapore again, and I want to pay respect to President the Mayor and to Chairman Ho, who sponsored this and allowed me to be the Hopi professor, and to Dean James Tong, who is my old friend. When I was thinking of retiring at age 70 from Harvard University, I tried to decide what would be the most important contribution I could make to the understanding of Asia. A few decades earlier, I'd written Japan as number one because I felt that Japan was a big rising power that we needed to know about. But now it's quite clear that the important country we need to understand is China, and therefore I wanted to do work on the understanding of China. And to me, as I thought about it, the obvious topic to pick was Deng Xiaoping and his era. He's an extraordinarily interesting person by himself, but this was, of course, the era that changed China. I think the legacy he left is a country that's rich, where at least several hundred million people have come up out of the poverty line. He left a country that is no longer divided and in terror from the Cultural Revolution, but one that is respected as a major nation in the world, that takes part in important affairs of the world. In my view, no leader of the 20th century had a greater impact on world history than Deng Xiaoping. And yet, there was no really good comprehensive picture of Deng Xiaoping and what he did and the era and the changes he brought. The outside world to bring out change in China. The first picture we have of Deng Xiaoping, the first picture we have of Deng Xiaoping is in France at age 16. When Deng was 15 in Sichuan in Guangnan County, where he was in the public middle school, he already took part in the May 4th demonstrations as a premature person, and he became already at that age committed to doing something for the country. The name of the village he came from was Paifang, and the name of that village came from Paifang, meaning Memorial Arch. The Memorial Arch in the village he grew up in was named for one of his ancestors about a century before, who had been one of the top leaders in China at that time, in Imperial Qing China. And the image that was central to him in that village was that if a bright young man had opportunities and proper training, he should serve the country, and he looked forward to that opportunity. At age 15, as I say, he was already committed as a patriot, demonstrating against the foreign powers that dominated the discussions in Versailles after World War I, and were returning Shandong not to China, but passing it over from Germany, the eastern portion of Shandong, not to China, but from Germany to Japan. And that was, of course, the background that aroused the May 4th movement, and he was already a premature young person at age 15 committed to the nationalism. When Deng went to China at age 20, It was part of a movement to try to learn about the outside world and science and technology so that they could bring it back to China and help build a modern country. Because there were not scholarships available at that time to study abroad, and even the rich people in China did not have enough money to pay the costs of university education abroad, some of them conceived of a program that would be part study, part work. They would go abroad and work in factories, and then they would earn enough money that they would be able to attend universities. And the universities that they went to, the country that they went to more than any other at that time, was France. Partly it was because France was considered such a great center of civilization, and partly it was because during World War I, more Chinese workers had gone abroad to France than any other country except to Russia. And something like 150,000 young Chinese workers had gone to France. And so it was logical for those people who realized the employment opportunities there to think that young Chinese could have